Welcome back. 2016, the election of Donald Trump represented for many people a watershed moment between truth and lies, between propaganda, between the real news of fake news, between truth as we want it to be and truth as it is. And families have been torn apart, states have been torn apart. The conflict seems to be unending. And what is the conflict over? What we can believe and what we cannot believe. How do we trust, or what mechanism or procedure can we have in place to trust people that are talking? They're saying this is true. How do we know? How do we know? Even in my own family, half my family is American and the other half is Canadian. And it's been remarkable to watch the division and the unwillingness to hear the other side. Today, we're not just talking about a willingness to hear the other side. Today, I want to talk about rational grounds for belief. Rational grounds for belief, and also rational grounds for disbelief. These are very common sense principles. These are hopefully just intuitively obvious to you when you see them. So I'm not trying to do anything fancy or complicated here, but these rational ways of thinking in order to believe and rational ways of encouraging disbelief, I believe would actually heal much of this division that's been going on. It's been going on much longer than 2016, of course. So today, why should we believe what we believe? And what are some of the rational grounds for doubt? I'm not saying I love my children more than coffee. I'm just saying that it would be a close call. Every day we hear claims that are unsupported, and they're constant everywhere around us. Claim this is true, this is true, this is true. Why should we believe these? Well, let's go through some very practical, straightforward ways in which we might be able to judge. When a reason or a claim comes to us and is completely unsupported, what do we do with it? It may seem obvious, but when we have two claims that conflict with one another, so maybe it's the claim that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, or it's the claim that it wasn't stolen, obviously these claims are in contradiction because it can't be both stolen and not stolen at the same time. They're what we would call mutually contradictory. So what do you do at that point? Well, until one of them is shown to be true, you need to suspend doubt. Obviously, they're not both true. Can you just pick and choose as it fits your opinion? Sure, you can. You're free to do that. But is it rational? No, it's not rational. You are only justified, rationally justified in believing in something when the conflict has been resolved. Well, how do we do that? Well, as we've been talking, we find good reasons for why we should believe one over the other. We look for grounds for doubt. Why should we doubt one over the other? Again, very straightforward, simple, but the actual mechanism of doing that can be tricky, as we will discuss, because of our biases, our prejudices, and what we want to be true. It is so hard to be rational when what I want to be true looks like something I should probably doubt. A good place to start this conversation is with the idea of common knowledge or common sense. Common knowledge is what you have already justified grounds for believing. You have common sense. You know, since you were young, that if you fall down on the sidewalk, gravity will pull you down. So gravity is sort of this catch-all example. We have good grounds for believing that if we drop this, it'll fall. Gravity. If we throw that, it'll fall. Gravity. So you have a lifetime of experience built around this idea of gravity pulling things down. We don't necessarily know the physical mechanism of gravity, but we know it exists. So when someone comes to you and says there's no such thing as that, and I don't know that anyone would ever do that, this is just a silly example, you have common knowledge or common sense that kind of makes it hard for that argument to be bought. A lifetime of experience, in other words. Now there's a distinction between common sense and rationally justified belief or rationally justified knowledge, but we all start with common sense or common knowledge. That's just who we are as a species. In fact, most of our knowledge of the universe, ourselves and others, is usually this common knowledge, just things that we've accepted as we've grown up. Very little of our belief structure, and I'm generalizing now, fallacy of generalization, but very little of our belief is this thing that we've studied in great detail and we have a lot of evidence for. It's just common knowledge, common sense. So we start there. Common knowledge or common sense depends on your audience. Discerning common knowledge amounts to asking this question: what would most people that I'm talking to, or the audience, or whoever's around me, accept as rational and justified without the need for extra support? What would they accept as rational without the extra need for support? We call that common knowledge. What everyone knows is different from common knowledge. There's this important distinction here. If I say germs are something that are bad, we should avoid germs, what I'm saying is probably known, I'm going to throw out a number there, to 90% of the people around me. They know germs are bad, right? Maybe even higher. 98% of people know germs are bad. But there'll be 2% of the population that doesn't know that. Common knowledge isn't what people literally know. It's what we are rationally justified in assuming people would know. Because we live in an enlightened culture, we have studies and scientists that have done work in the nature of germs. We can actually see these things now through artificial magnification. We are rationally justified in using that as a baseline for an argument. 100 years ago, that wouldn't work very well because they would think you were crazy talking about germs. What does this mean? It means that the burden of proof for showing somebody wrong shifts when they disagree with common knowledge. It shifts when they disagree with common knowledge. So if someone comes to you and they want to have an argument about why the earth is flat, it's common knowledge that the earth is not flat. It's well accepted. It's in the scientific literature. So the instinct is to dismiss a flat earther. And when the flat earther, if you've ever experienced this, someone who just has a wildly different belief than that held in your culture, it can be a bit jarring, but it's not your responsibility necessarily to prove what is established as common sense, unless you want to. And I would argue it's often a good idea to examine and to doubt what's common sense. One of these outrageous examples, maybe not so much. Less outrageous examples are climate change deniers, or the vaccine hesitant, or even now the anti-science crowd that seems to have a growing voice. In all of these situations, they're rejecting common knowledge. They're rejecting the basis of much scientific culture today. So what do you do with that? How do we begin to process challenges to even common knowledge or common sense? And it's interesting because there are many wild claims going on right now in the media, debating even the basics of science. Science is just this thing that doesn't rely on evidence, that it's all propaganda. I mean, this is really interesting challenges now against common knowledge. But we'll come back to this in just a moment. So in all fairness to the flat earthers and the climate change deniers and the vaccine hesitant, while these positions may be challenging common knowledge, the status quo, common sense even, they may be right. There have been experiences in history in which the scientific community was shocked that the outlier or the marginal view actually turned out to be more appropriate than the dominant view. We need to be open to that and the reality that while the outlier may seem strange and awkward, they may be true. But rationally speaking, it's not helpful to assume that the least credible or the least discussed or the least rational perspective has therefore some kind of merit to it. Right? It needs to prove itself. The burden of proof is to bring the marginal view into the mainstream. And those can be very interesting conversations. But here's the rule or the logic that I'm trying to convey. We should proportion our belief to the evidence. That is, we should devote ourselves to the ideas or the claims or the beliefs that have the most evidence. Devoting ourselves to the marginal or the less heard arguments without reason, without more evidence than the mainstream view, is irrational and potentially dangerous. This is so simple, but it might save lives. Consider COVID. COVID has created a dividing line for many people between the truths that we can trust and the people we can trust and those that we cannot. But which side has more evidence? We're going to talk about experts in a minute. We're going to talk about doubt in a minute. But it seems really straightforward that when we're committed to the rational perspective, rational means looking for the preponderance or the weight of evidence, where most experts lie, where the most common sense or common knowledge is based, is the most healthy, the most probably true. But is it guaranteed? No. Are experts sometimes wrong? Absolutely. And as I've already mentioned, sometimes the dominant voice is just prejudicial and it doesn't see the truth for what it is. And we need to be prepared for that as well. But still, for all of these mistakes or possible mistakes of common knowledge, common sense, it's still the most reliable place to at least start the conversation. So what makes an expert? An expert is someone who is more knowledgeable in a particular subject or field than others. That's it. An expert has more knowledge. And because they have more knowledge, they have more life experience in a particular field. For those who have never been to university, done a master's degree, done a PhD, got a doctorate in a field, it can seem like, well, what does that mean exactly? It means that to be an expert, a person has devoted their lives to a particular section of a discipline, and they've tried to go as deeply as they can into that area. They're obsessed, in other words, with medical science in this area, if it's vaccines, or they're obsessed with mechanical engineering or law, whatever they're doing. They have access to more information. Their lives are consumed with the information. And hopefully they have better judgment in that area because they've been living in that much longer than any of us have. So what's an expert? An expert isn't just somebody who's read Wikipedia. They've devoted their lives to seeing the world in one particular area more accurately than any of us. So they can develop judgment that's more sound than any of us. And it's overtly, it's kind of offensive in a way to say, well, I personally know better than a medical expert on this, or I know better than an auto mechanic on that, without any reason to think that, except that I simply want to be true. I want my opinion to be right. And that's natural. We all want to be right. We all want our opinions to be true. But the presence of experts raises some interesting challenges for those of us who want to hold on to our opinion and call it truth at the same time. This is raising something that's difficult for many of us, which is trust. Trust in the experience and the education of experts. Why is this difficult? Because we want to trust ourselves first. This is kind of the basis. We do trust ourselves first. And then trusting a stranger, someone I've never met who has a PhD in a field, and they're telling me this is how I should live my life. They're telling me I should get a jab, a vaccine or something. That can be unnerving. Why should I trust the expert? And again, it boils down to this idea of reason or rationality. What is the healthiest way for me to live my life? It's basing it in something rational or reasonable, and that's no guarantee. And when I want to make life decisions, who should I consult? Well, the people who have devoted their lives to it, the expert. It's so strange then that we live in a culture that has such a difficult time making even basic distinctions between experts and non-experts. It's wild to watch the number of people that will watch a news show, whatever news outlet, whatever media that you're interested in, Fox News, CNN, NBC, whatever, MSNBC, or maybe you follow somebody on YouTube, there's so many different voices out there making these claims, and so few of them have any kind of expertise. Strangely, most of the people who have expertise are too busy working in the hospitals and working at the universities, and they're too busy writing books to be on YouTube, to be a popular voice, because they're so busy in these other areas. So we don't hear them as often. I'm generalizing, of course. But we face a problem of the self-proclaimed expert. The self-proclaimed expert, the person who puts a white lab coat on and tries to sell you dental products on a commercial on TV. And just because they're wearing a white lab coat gives them authority, even though these are just hired actors. The news pundits, these voices that make these claims that have no real rational grounds for them, except that it gets your attention, it gets clicks, and it makes money in advertising. The division now is between experts and non-experts, and it's driven by, you guessed it, money, attention, fame, popularity. All of these things can boil and mix together. The problem of expertise is that the self-proclaimed expert, at least, often comes along as psychologically persuasive. They're selling you something because they're not tethered to truth, because they're not obligated to speak the truth based in expertise of knowledge. They can say anything they want, and they know they'll get a large audience that accepts them because they're saying not the truth, but something that resonates with people that they already accept as the truth. It's reaffirming the bias. It's reaffirming the worldview that they have. again, generating money, fame, attention, all these different things, but not necessarily securing health for that community, for those people, for the world. So question, can you think of examples in which something is being accepted in your culture because it is appealing or attractive or stimulating in some way, but it's pretty obviously false? It's pretty obviously false that it's not the case. There's no evidence for it, but a large swath of the population believes it. It's happening all the time. It's happening around us. So this problem of reliable versus unreliable, reason and doubt, what we should believe, what we should doubt, is clearly a very important thing to consider. Millions of voters in the U.S. believe that it was stolen. Even now, long after the election, there are people who still believe. There are people who still claim that vaccines cause autism. Even though that was a claim based years ago, there are still people who believe it. Why? Because they heard or they imagined in their minds these children getting vaccines and getting autism, and that's a terrible thing. We don't want that. And it sticks with us. But just because it sticks doesn't make it true. Just because it resonates, it's psychologically persuasive, but it doesn't make it rational to believe. And so we have the problem. And it's a problem that I really can only speak about in generalities, which is what feels good and what's real. What works intellectually and what works psychologically in a palpable, what I can digest versus what is actually the case. Two different worlds in a way. A billionaire being loud, again, someone wearing a white lab coat, having lots of supporters that follow me on Twitter or something, does not make me an expert. I may be an expert and be a billionaire. That's fine. But having these things doesn't make me an expert. But unfortunately, it does mean that you're popular, or it can mean that you're quite popular. And therein lies the danger. Being popular, being a voice that people listen to, but not being credible, right? And potentially dangerous. You may say many wonderful things that help people, but also when we untether ourselves from that rational grounds for belief, for having evidence and good reasons for something, we're in danger. But let's be honest, again, experts are not always what they're cut out to be, and we need to doubt even experts. Obviously, we need to doubt the news pundits and the social media conglomerates and the popular voices that are out there, but we also need to find ways of testing experts. What do you do when experts don't agree? Well, in the case of a 50-50 split, if 50% of experts said there's climate change, global warming, and 50% said there's not, you should suspend doubt, because that's a clear disagreement. But when 80, 90, 95% say there is, or there isn't, and they do say there is, then you have strong grounds for accepting it. But that doesn't make that belief permanent. 5 years later, 10 years later, they may not all agree. They may not all have consensus. So truth can be a bit of a moving target depending on current research. And that's okay. That's to be accepted. But in the moment right now, what should I believe? Very simply, again, common sense. Whatever has the most evidence, the most voices of experts, not necessarily the most followers, not necessarily the thing I like to hear the most, you believe that. That's the most rational way forward. But as I've already mentioned, being rational and being happy, being rational and believing something that makes me feel good in my mind, they're not necessarily the same thing. So we have this problem now, not just of having a toolkit called reason or rationality, but also the motivation to want to do it. Right? Two different things. So the next time you see someone who claims to be an expert, run through this quick list and ask yourself, do these people fall in line with the minimal prerequisites? First, education and training. And by education, I don't mean just a bachelor's degree in social work and now they're a therapist, or maybe they went to high school and they focused on geography, so now they're an expert. You get the idea. I mean education as years of intensive scholarship in an area. Then they begin to qualify. Some jobs don't require that much. An electrician, you have to get quite a bit of education. Then you have on the job practicum. All right, so you're not expected to do 20 years, but to do brain surgery, you're going to be going obviously for a lot longer. Hopefully, you didn't just do an on-the-job training in brain surgery and 2 weeks later you're a brain surgeon. You get the idea. So on big topics like the climate, health, maybe even finance, we need to go where the experts have really devoted a lot of time. Also, not just education and training, but how is this expert, this particular expert we're hearing, how reliable are their judgments in the field? So have they practiced law? Have they practiced medicine? Have they practiced what they are studying? We can look at peers, often peer-reviewed literature that they've written. So when you really go up and you get a PhD in a particular area, you are expected to publish. And then your peers look at your published work and they judge you harshly. And if you can survive that harsh judgment, you're said to have been successful. And it's, again, a very intuitive process, trial by fire. You're not just a YouTuber, you're not just a blogger, you're not just a whatever-er. You're someone who's proven yourselves through putting your ideas out there. People have judged them, and they've judged them thumbs up or thumbs down. And again, the preponderance of evidence will be one way or the other, that you're of a quality mindset there on this issue or not. So looking at professional achievements, degrees, publishing, and so on, conferences, and what your peers think. Not in all circumstances are those things available. Medical doctors, general practitioners, as an example, don't do a lot of publishing, but they have a lot of field experience. They're expected to be in the hospital, in the ER. They go through these things, and then their peers judge them on whether they're actually doing the job well. So it's not necessarily just writing books and whatnot. One of the reasons to dismiss experts, some of the reasons to dismiss experts as plausible, when there's evidence of bias. And the evidence of bias can come in many forms, and it boils down often to they have financial gain, or they have loyalty to a cause, maybe, personal ideology, a devotion to something, or any way in which their judgment seems to be compromised. Maybe they're sexist, and their particular discussion on a particular issue is obviously driven by that. Here's an example. I've never met Gwyneth Paltrow. She seems cool, just in the media from what I've seen, and she married Iron Man, so obviously Gwyneth Paltrow is cool. But she has a company called Goop, and it has run into a lot of controversy because their company offers a number of products, sometimes outrageously priced, but the products based in health claims that are unsubstantiated. And in fact, many health medical experts have warned of the dangers of many of these products. Without going through them piece by piece, just to give you one point of reference, in 2017, Truth in Advertising filed a complaint with California regulators. I'm reading this from Wikipedia. Regarding over 50 health claims that company made, which resulted in a settlement of $125,000 and a 5-year injunction prohibiting the company from making unsubstantiated claims about the characteristics or health benefits of its products. In other words, you can't say these things anymore because what you're saying is inaccurate, and I'm going to make the inference here, dangerous. If I'm making a health claim on a product and people use this product, it could be potentially dangerous. But there are many others. Just at a quick Google search, you'll see Goop and Gwyneth Paltrow coming up as controversial. But the company's made millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. Why? Because she's a celebrity and she's famous. And when she puts her name on something and people hear it, well, that instinctively, we just listen to the people that we listen to, so we instinctively believe them. But here's an example that's been quite a bit more popular than I realized until I looked into it, of a celebrity making claims that are unsubstantiated and dangerous. And she should not have been, the company certainly, whether or not she actually knew this, but the company certainly should not have been making those claims or putting those products out. What happens when it's a little more serious, though? What happens when a company pushes for a drug, a pharmaceutical company pushes for a drug, or a politician pushes for a law, and they do not have the requisite expertise? And usually pharmaceutical companies have experts, but they're driven by profit, right? They have a clear bias depending on the pharmaceutical company. Again, in reference to COVID, these pharmaceutical companies that have the ingredients or the recipe for making vaccines, but they don't want to make it an open book recipe that any country can make. Think about that for a moment. They're making billions and billions and billions of dollars in vaccines, and they're unwilling to share the recipe during a global pandemic. They hold the copyright. They hold the patent to it. It's one of those examples of a company that has probably made more than enough money by now. Maybe their bias or their desire for profit could give way to a little more charitable thinking. Okay, I'm a little off track. So here we are, we're living in a world, claims are being made. They're being made often unsubstantiated, without support, and people are believing them. And you're not surprised by that. I'm not surprised by that. But the implications are profound. People can die by believing certain claims without support. So slow down and begin to judge things as closely as possible, looking for evidence for why. Even when we accept the view that we should be following or listening to experts, we still have to doubt to some degree. We still have to question. Even when they have the expertise, the education, they've been vetted by their peers, we still have to watch. Another caveat is that experts on matters of fact, where there are studies and evidence, that's one thing. On matters of taste, moral, social, political issues, experts will be a part of these things informing our views, but they can't be the sole determining factor regarding how we should run society. Again, a part of it, but we as a collective, as a society, need to make our own choices. So we risk defaulting our own freedom to experts when we simply do what we're told. We can't do that because there simply aren't enough experts in all fields of life to do that as a start, but also it's not rationally justified to simply defer to the common consensus at a given time on all matters. You need to make some choice here too. So it comes to now personal experience. Personal experience is very important. Personal experience informs our decisions. Again, I believe more often than experts do. So let's talk a little bit about how our personal experience might lead us astray. Impairment, expectation, and innumeracy. These sound a little wordier than they are. Again, I'm hoping these will be pretty practical and straightforward. Impairment, in terms of personal experience. So I have experience right now regarding coffee and whether it tastes good or not. And I go outside and I have a personal experience about how well they built the sidewalks and these sorts of things. But if I'm sick, tired, stressed out, drunk, and I'm drinking coffee or walking down the street, my experience is entirely different. But also, my experience is different depending on whether or not I'm wearing glasses. Like my actual sensory apparatus inform how I see the world or not. And I would like to think that I see the world accurately and that I know the world accurately. But time and time again, studies in psychology and biology show us that we aren't very good at seeing the world. I know, it sounds weird, but we're not very good at noticing change. We're not very good at remembering. Study after study has shown how much our minds fabricate reality. They change our memories. The older I get, I see myself differently in the past. I perceive myself differently as a young person. And why? Because things are not fixed in stone. Things, our ideas and our perceptions are not objective like we would like. That's dangerous if true. And please, cognitive psychology. Google cognitive psychology and availability heuristics and availability biases, and you'll see this research that's fascinating regarding how little we actually see of the world. Expectation. So it's not just that I'm confused or I don't see clearly or my memories don't work very well. We have this thing called expectation, and expectation pushes us to perceive what we expect to perceive. You've heard that before, that we see what we expect to see, and that's efficient. Our brains are wired to be efficient. They're not constantly seeking out deep, meaningful truths in every experience. That would be exhausting. Right? So in a way, we're geared towards flippancy. We're geared towards fast, so we see what we expect to see. And the interesting part of that is that this expectation has a much stronger force on it than we realize. We realize, I expect to see something, but we don't realize how much that pushes us in life. To the point in some, if I'm generalizing, to the point in some instances of intentional blindness, that we're so focused that our minds are actually cutting reality out. We're so focused on seeing what we want to or seeing what we expect to, that we're pushing out or pushing away reality. Expectation, in other words, pushes us not just to illusion, where we kind of see things awkwardly that may or may not be true, but potentially into delusion, into a fictional fantasy world. And that's where we are as a world. People looking at the other political side, the other person who doesn't believe what they believe about vaccines or democracy or the climate, and they're looking at that other person going, how can you possibly believe that? Both sides are looking at the other person and how can you possibly believe that? Because we're driven in large part by expectation, intentional blindness, and an unwillingness to reason together. Just not even an unwillingness, sometimes an overt, screw you, I'm not going to reason with you and talk rationally. So all these things are playing into creating an unhealthy world. It's very difficult to resolve. A third one in this, and I know I'm kind of packing on the negativity here, is innumeracy. And this one is also hard to pin down. But basically, it's when people over or underestimate probabilities, that the chances of something happening or the chances of being true. What we know reliably, again, from things like relatively new fields like cognitive psychology, is that humans are terrible at estimating probabilities. And we see this in practical terms, in terms of the gambler's fallacy. Phrases like, my luck is about to change. I don't know if you've ever been to Las Vegas. And after I lost $300, I started to think to myself, well, surely I must start to win soon. And I began to believe, and this is why we keep gambling when we're in Las Vegas, that things have been bad, so surely they must change. Why do we think that? Because we want that. Is there any rational ground at all to think that if I bet 300 or 300,000 that eventually I would start to win? No. The house always wins. So you can go and you can spend $1 million and you will win some and you'll lose some. But at the end of the night, it is perfectly conceivable that I could spend $1 million and still lose everything. But in my head, I'll be betting every dollar, every thousand, every 100,000, believing that my luck might change. And that's irrational. It's simply irrational. Unless, now this is where it would become rational, I watch the slot machine, I start to tally some numbers, I realize there's an algorithm, I realize when it will pay out and when it won't, and I let other people put money in, and then I have some sense of when that algorithm is going to kick in, and then I start to spend money at that point. Then I have some rational grounds for saying, based on history, I have some sense of rationally, mathematically, the future, that's different. Making a belief in life based on arbitrary desire is so dangerous, but we do it all the time. Gambler's fallacy. Let's dive a little bit more deeper into how we fool ourselves. And there are three things I want to talk about in terms of fooling ourselves: resisting contrary evidence, looking for confirming evidence, and preferring available evidence. Yikes. It feels like life is a shell game. And so you have these shells, and the truth of the world is under one shell. And for whatever reason, a lot of us just kind of throw that shell right off the table, and we just play this game of moving shells. Instead of trying to find the truth, we just kind of passively, flippantly play these games when the truth was available to us all along. Maybe it's because we're lazy. Maybe it's because we simply want to avoid the truth because we're afraid of it. We're afraid of the truth. Maybe it's the truth is inconvenient and we don't want to rock the boat, so we just get rid of that shell with the truth under it, and we just play with the ones that are left, as if that was satisfying. And it's not. Right? It's not. We're fooling ourselves when we're doing this silly shell game. So the first one that a lot of people do is resisting contrary evidence. This one's the psychologically comforting thing. It's comforting to ignore the truth, right? Whether it's about global warming, or maybe we have a high debt load as a society, taking a lot of debt. Well, we'll just pretend that that's not actually happening. The studies, again, I'm being very general. Please Google these things and how these studies have been done over the years. But our resistance to the truth is not often overt. So let's say we have two sides. We're talking about electric cars. I'm just throwing out an example. And one person says electric cars are a good idea. Another person says electric cars are a bad idea. Both of these people are already biased. Maybe one works in the area of electric cars. Maybe one sells internal combustion engine cars. So they have vested interest in this. But instead of just saying to the other person, no, you're wrong, they may actually engage in an argument. And they may give reasons back and forth why their position is accurate. But the whole time they're pretending to be really rational, they're actually being overly critical in one way or another that bends the credibility of evidence. And it can be so subtle. But I mean, this happens to me when I'm arguing with my wife. She wants this, and I say, I think that's a terrible idea. My instinct, my bias, my prejudice is leaning me to be more critical towards her than my own position. Right? And it's just that simple, resisting contrary evidence. It's not really the flip side of this, but complementary to this is looking for confirming evidence. We seek and we remember what fits our worldview, what fits our ideology. So on the one hand, there's this remembering thing where we simply remember what's more sensational that fits our version of events or the truth that we want. But there's also that part where we seek something out more. We go out of our way to find evidence while ignoring the rest. So we kind of sometimes generate a truth there as well. Not healthy, not helpful. And again, it fits into this overall idea of fooling ourselves. Do we prefer that which is more psychologically memorable, striking, and available? Absolutely. But does that lead to problems? Of course. And here's an example of how this leads to problems. When we hear something, again, sensational, as I already mentioned, it sticks with us. Much of this is based on what's called a hasty generalization. It's a fallacy. The fallacy is errors of logic. So the hasty generalization is in which we, as individuals, draw a conclusion about what's right and what's wrong based on a very limited experience, and then we say that that's true of all things or all experiences that are like that. So here's the example. I go to a pizza store. It's a chain. Let's say it's called Pizza for Us, and it's making this up, and it's a chain. But I just go to one particular branch, and I have pizza there, and it's kind of bad. I don't like it. It was overly expensive. I don't know. It was kind of soggy. And my friends are asking me, hey, where do you want to go for lunch? And I say, we can never go to this chain in any country, in any continent, because it's gross. Well, here's my mistake. I've taken one experience of one store, and I've extrapolated to all. Let's see, there's 100 of them around the world. Obviously, that's not accurate. It may be appeasing in a way, and it's easy, it's efficient, but it's certainly not truth begging. We're not looking into preserving the truth. It's kind of just, again, flippancy and efficient does not mean rational. So in terms of public scares, the same, not hysteria, but the same hasty generalization can take over. For instance, you no doubt have heard about how cell phones might cause cancer. And this is a legitimate question. We want to know if cell phones cause cancer. But when people started talking about this, it became so psychologically available or sensational that it stuck in people's minds. Do cell phones cause cancer? Well, as of right now, and it's been decades, the answer seems to be largely no. They may cause cancer, but the preponderance of evidence right now is that they don't, especially if they're used appropriately. So that's why we still have cell phones. But when we overestimate risk, when we overestimate dangers based on their psychologically persuasive nature, we may stop doing things like using cell phones, which is maybe not a big deal for you. But what happens to that example that I already gave about autism being caused by vaccines? So we stop giving vaccines to children. There we have an example of how the irrational mindset is dangerous, it's threatening, personally and for all of us. All right, let's talk about the news. So this is the big one. So many of us are dealing not just with news, but social media. Information is coming at us every day, bundles of claims coming at us every day that are not necessarily true. We know many of them are not true, not always useful, even though they may claim to be useful, and sometimes just overt lies, propaganda. None of this constitutes knowledge. Information through news, through social media, through whatever you're getting, this does not constitute knowledge. What is knowledge? Knowledge is when we take the information or the claims of the world and we find things that are supported. And we may be wrong, but at least we find some kind of support to them, and that's when it becomes knowledge. Now, there's another sense in which we might say, what is knowledge? Knowledge is just what we have stuck in our head. But in this case, I'm using the word knowledge to say that which is intellectually credible. Right? So how much of what you believe about the world is intellectually credible? We have a genuine problem with the news. We know that the news is not created equal, that some outlets are more responsible than others. But we know virtually all of them are influenced by profit margin, a desire for money. We know all of them are run by human beings. And we know human beings, as editors, reporters, producers, can very easily massage, manipulate, and just outright pervert a news story that fits with their biases. And most of these people are not experts. They're talking heads. They don't have advanced degrees in science, but they're running stories in science. They don't have advanced degrees in politics, but they're running political stories. So the media is often driven by people who are utterly uninformed on the nuances. And the very structure of the media itself is sound bites, very quick sound bites in which depth is impossible. So what we have is a world run on information, largely just throwing things at you, designed to garner attention, to garner advertising, because advertising fuels the media, not expertise. Even when the experts come on, they're limited to a very, very short, if at all, conversation in which, again, a few sound bites are conveyed, but the substance is not. So what do? Well, we can try and shut out the world, all but experts. So we'd shut out media, Twitter, Snapchat, we shut out MSNBC, CBC, Fox News, we just shut them all out. That doesn't seem entirely possible or entirely healthy. So what do? We try to sort through the news. We start by looking, obviously the issue of expertise will come here, but we start to look for conflicts with our common knowledge, our common sense. And does it conflict with that? That's a good place to start. Again, common sense is by no means a guarantee of truth, but it's a good place to start. We look for reporter bias, prejudice. Are they kind of framing things in one way or another? And how do we know? Well, we will have to look at other news sources to know if they're framing it in a particular way. It's very easy to do. Watch any headline story on MSNBC, then go watch it on Fox News, and you'll see slant, right? Both ways. It's incredible, it's obvious, and it's kind of frightening in a way how bold people can just pervert the situation. Look at the source. Where is the information coming from? Why would we believe one over the other? Look for missing information. This is common. It's very easy to take out a small detail in a story and change the texture almost completely in a story. And of course, part of all of this is just looking for emphasis. It's not necessarily that they're intentionally perverting something. It's not like they're evil or something. Sometimes they can be. But it's just their personal emphasis because of a worldview that they have. Just by virtue of living in a country and speaking a particular language, you are giving something emphasis. So we just look for that. So therefore we can dismiss everybody, but so that we can be more mindful of how the world is being packaged or prepackaged and delivered to us. Okay, so the elephant in the room here is advertising and persuasion and propaganda. Advertising is everywhere. It's what fuels so much of the industries around us, whether you want to buy a car, they want advertising, or you're going to buy a health service. Okay. But advertisers are not beholden to reason or to evidence. They're beholden to a bottom line, which is profit. And that bottom line profit is more easily accessed or achieved through manipulation and propaganda, not through being rational. Not through sitting down and having study after study shown to people. You're not going to watch the evening news or something and see an expert sit there for an hour talking about all the case studies as to why you should buy a product. They don't do that. They have a 30-second or 1-minute window that they spend maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars on to do whatever they can to get you to buy something short of overt lies, because they don't want to get in trouble with the law. So they will do things like appeals to authority, appeals to emotion, appeals to popularity, and the hasty generalization and appeals to feeling that we've talked about, as well as faulty analogies, among others. But before we look at these individually, here's another problem. We tend to treat experts in this culture like they were advertisers. We should naturally have a healthy skepticism for both. But obviously, the advertisers, who are largely responsible for conditioning the messages of mainstream media, because mainstream media doesn't want to upset its advertisers, these people are not pushing a rational agenda or even a healthy agenda. And I'm generalizing, maybe some of them are, but mostly it doesn't seem to be the case at all. Experts, by contrast, we expect them to be pushing a healthy agenda in terms of finding rational grounds for belief, truth about the world. These are worlds apart, but somehow, for some people, they equally dismiss both of them, especially when the message doesn't align with what they want to believe. Both the experts and the advertisers, they're all just liars. Everybody's a liar, so they ignore them. That extraordinary dismissiveness is also not rational. Okay, so how do the advertisers kind of lead us astray? Some of their persuasive techniques are pretty obvious, and you know these. Identification. That is, we try to get people to identify with a particular person. So they have celebrity endorsements, like Gwyneth Paltrow, who is famous and rich and attractive. So we want to be like this person, so we will buy the product that this person is pushing. It's just that simple. It's brand identification, but instead of a brand, say with a Nike swoosh, it's with a person. Both of them, of course, are comparable. Catchy slogans, memorable catchphrases that get our emotions, our ideas connected with a product. Misleading comparisons, deliberate vagueness, just throwing out these things that, just say stuff that sounds good, but when you really hammer down on the language, it's not actually saying anything. Just watch the news, watch the ads in between clips. If you don't watch the news, just go on YouTube. You'll get a clip on that advertising clip. Maybe while you're watching this video, there are advertising slogans being thrown out. Confidence in claims about subjective things, you really shouldn't be that confident in, because they're subjective claims. If they were an objective claim, well, then you can give it a vote of confidence based on a rational determining of whether or not it's accurate or not. And then just exaggeration. It's everywhere. Exaggerating. Weasel words are often used with this. Weasel words are a fun thing to think about. Just imagine an actual weasel trying to catch it. They're tiny, they're quick, right? It's hard to pin them down to know what they're about, because they're always gone. Likewise, a weasel word is very hard to pin down. It's very squishy. It's gone the moment you try and capture it. Here's a popular one. The word help. It's in every advertising slogan. Help. Our new weight loss formula will help you lose weight. Okay, how about this? Our new beer will help you feel better about yourself. Well, let's combine them both. Our new beer will help you lose weight. Our new beer will help you lose weight. Well, beers are pretty high in calories. How's that going to help me? Well, if push comes to shove, we would just say that in going to the fridge to get a beer, you burned calories. So in picking up our beer, we've helped you lose weight. So is it a lie? No. Is it garbage language and irrational to accept? Yes. But could advertisers say the beer helps them lose weight? Technically, yeah. And that's the world we live in. A crazy world in which weasel words, emotional or psychological persuasion, in which emphases, deliberate vagueness, in which propaganda is supported by major billion-dollar organizations in advertising and media. We live in a screwy world. Right? We need to begin to think more rationally for our own health benefits. Okay, so where have we come with all of this? The divisions that we see in culture, among families, over the nature of truth, are driven by many of the things we just discussed. Our laziness, a reluctance to be rational. And I personally believe one of the best ways to heal the world and to move forward as a people is to find that some sense of meaning of rationality, a greater reliance on experts, but not on a blind adherence to experts, willingness to have conversations about evidence, knowing that experts and evidence don't answer all of our questions. Life is so much bigger often, but they will answer many of our most important questions if we are willing to commit rationally. I know I keep using the word rational, and it can be interpreted in different ways, but please try and see where this is going, this idea of supporting claims. Not a perfect system, but light years better than the current system in which people dismiss experts and the propaganda experts as quickly without any second thought. We need to slow down and realize that there is good reasons for belief. So in summary, what are we going to do with all this? Well, we need to live a life in which we don't just accept unsupported claims. We need to live a life in which we try to trust the authority of experts as much as possible, even when it hurts our own cherished views. But we're not going to trust the authority of experts blindly. We need to look into things as much as we can on our own, but still recognizing that none of us has a PhD in immunology and vaccine research. So what do you do with that? It's a struggle, especially when we live in a world in which there's this constant flow of information, most of which is driven by profit margins and propaganda and designed to get us to buy, think, and feel in certain ways that are not necessarily healthy for us. We realize that in general we have good reason for doubting advertisers, and that in general we have good reason for trusting experts. That's tough. Trusting experts, especially when they don't seem to be on the right political divide. That's a tough one. But again, what leads us is not what feels good psychologically, but what seems to be most rational, what seems to be most supported. And this, I believe, will help heal a fractured world. Not that reason fixes everything, not that we have experts that can make all of our decisions. We don't. But there's a general belief that reasoning together is better than screaming at one another.